All right, everybody. Hope you're doing well. Hopefully, you can hear me. Hope you're having a good evening. We're ready to start. I got with me Recluse from VISUPview. I'm a huge fan of Recluse's blog and the work that he has done. Recluse, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Yeah. Well, so today we're going to discuss. Hopefully Richard Mellon Scafie and his well, actually, I guess the whole Mellon family, should I say, and their connections to the Hidden Right, which they've been had a lot to do with the manipulation of the world order, and not many truthers know about the Mellon family or really know their connections, because you would put them up there. I guess I would too, up there with. The Morgan, J.P. Morgan family, the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, like you had in your blog, everybody knows about Soros and the Koch brothers, but no one knows about the Mellon family.
Well, in a sense, I would say you would probably at this point even put the Mellons a little step higher than the Morgan or the Rockefeller family. I mean,
Interesting.
the Morgans really haven't had like a major family member, I think, since Henry Sturgis Morgan, the founder of Morgan Stanley, who died in 1989 or something like that. I mean, if you look around enough, I mean, they're still around. You see them crop up in the society pages in New York City and what have you. But as far as I can tell, I mean, they just kind of seem like, I mean, I'm sure they seem well taken care of, but I don't know that they wield anywhere near the kind of power that the Morgan family did in the pre-World War II era and even up into the mid-50s, 60s, and so forth. And with the Rockefellers, I think it's kind of a similar case. Now that David Rockefeller is no longer with us, and depending upon what conspiracy theories you buy into, anyway. But I mean, it doesn't seem like there's really another major member of the family that has the power and the sway to step in and take David's place. I mean, the closest you have is what Jay Rockefeller. Here from West Virginia, and even in that case, Jay just doesn't seem like he had anywhere near the same kind of power that David or any of the other brother generations did. I mean, once again, I'm sure their family is going to be, very comfortable for many, many generations to come. But in terms of wielding the kind of political influence that a few of the earlier generations did, probably not. But the Mellons, they kind of seem to have that magic touch, so to speak, that you could attribute to the the Rothschilds in that sense as well. Maybe some of the other, European dynasties, the Astor family kind of comes to mind, the Cecil family. But, contrary to a lot of what you hear in a lot of the conspiracy sites and what have you, some of these families really do fade away over time.
To wax and wane in power to some degree, or maybe it goes more underground throughout the generations, and they will less power. I mean, I'm pretty sure the Rothschild family still holds some sort of
Yeah,
significant
the
amount of power.
Rothschilds, yes, 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 they definitely, and that's what is even more impressive about them and the Mellon family is the fact that they have really continued to pass down the Midas touch, if you will, generation to generation for so long now. Well, they originate from Scotland, which in and of itself is interesting given the really incredible sway certain Scottish families have had over the years in the UK and so forth. And, it's really curious when you get into the World War II era and so forth with the OSS. In the latter period, you see the Mellons and the Bruceys over there, the Bruce family. A lot of times in London with some of these other families in that region of the world, and they all kind of had this intertwining Scottish heritage. But getting back to the origins of the Mellon family in the United States, the first really major one was Thomas Mellon, a judge from Pittsburgh who was the one who had started the Mellon Bank, which is where the family fortune had been based off of. But it was really his son, Andrew Mellon, that turned the family into an absolute dynasty. Of course, Andrew was the long-serving Secretary of Treasury. Uh, through beginning in, what was it, I believe the era of Kelvin Coolidge or something like that,
Yes.
continuing on to Harding and then into Hoover and so forth. And obviously one of the more controversial secretaries of the Treasury, to put it mildly. It was quite fashionable to blame him for the Great Depression during the time of FDR. So, he was a major figure. He was, if you're inclined to such thinking, also a major Freemason and so forth. He contributed that fountain, the Mellon fountain in Washington, D.C., which, depending again, if you look into this kind of stuff, could be said to have some interesting symbolism in it. So, yeah.
Also, where it came out that he was a Mason from the dedication of that fountain, correct?
I believe so. It wasn't, certainly, I don't think it was well known up to that point.
Because I remember reading in your blog that it came up that he was a Mason, because he was a well-known Mason because of the dedication of the Mellon fountain. That that showed, because they talk about the Masonic tradition and the fountain in and of itself, being carved through masonry and everything. So that's very interesting that it came up that the Mellon family was at the very beginning steeped in masonry here in the United States. And of course, you mentioned too about Mellon is why doesn't no one talk about Andrew Mellon and his policies when it comes to the Federal Reserve and to the economic crisis during the late 1920s and 1930s? Like, no one mentions them. Like, you talk about how G. Edward Griffin, who's a long-term John Birch Society member, does not discuss him. Mellon's name does not come up in his book, The Creature from Jekyll Island. Or even Ellen H. Brown's book, Web of Debt. I mean, Mellon's not even mentioned. It's like he doesn't even exist. But yet, and when I was reading through your blog, it reminded me, because I was like, well, this kind of sounds a lot like trickle-down economics or Reaganomics, and you actually bring it up later in your blog entry about Mellon. But yeah, why do you think that is? Do you think it's because of them having connections to the right with the John Birch Society, everything? I guess in the case of Griffin, that's the reason why they don't mention Mellon and his involvement in the rise of the Federal Reserve System?
Well, quite possibly. I mean, certainly when you get into kind of that era, this was around the time that Richard Mellon Scaife had really established himself as a major, major sugar daddy of the right wing. So there's quite possibly that angle to it. I mean, to some extent, I think it also might be that a lot of conspiracy researchers have just kind of overlooked the Mellon family. I mean, they were from the Pittsburgh area after all. They didn't really come from that, high society establishment, kind of Anglo-American establishment you saw in New York City and Boston and a lot of the major cities in the New England area and so forth. So I think there's certain contributing factors that all of these things play into that has led to them being, definitely under the radar, a lot of people's radars over the years.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you on that. Is that pretty much everything on Andrew Mellon? That you came up in your research, or I didn't find much more when I was looking into him, but does that pretty much cover him?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, obviously there's been the speculation as well that he had some ties to the organized crime syndicates and so forth. Of course, that kind of came up a bit in that one show that was on HBO. Steve Buscemi was
Boardwalk Empire.
Yeah, Boardwalk Empire. So, yeah, I mean, you kind of had all that sort of intertwining with the bootleggers and so forth during Prohibition and that type of thing. But, certainly he was a major powerhouse in his era. I mean, it has been kind of exercised now, but I mean, along with J.P. Morgan, I mean, a lot of ways he was kind of the personification of the robber barons of corporate greed and the
Yes.
Depression and so forth. So, yeah, I guess moving along a bit, some of the other noteworthy family lines, the Mellon family, there was, of course, James Ross Mellon, who would go on to have a daughter, I believe it was, Margaret Mellon, who married into the Hitchcock family. And that contributed to some very interesting characters later on. There was Peggy Hitchcock, who had an affair with Timothy Leary at one point, and eventually she would introduce him to brother William Mellon
Yeah.
Hitchcock, who would go on to become the financier for the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, the largest LSD syndicate in the world by the late 1960s. He was also, before that, the patron of Timothy Leary. He had opened up his estate at Millbrook to Leary to conduct his whatever their psychedelic experiments and so forth. And before that, though, of course, and this is something I've gone into a lot in my blog, he turns up in the Profumo affair,
Yes.
which in a lot of ways really was one of the pivotal deep events of the 20th century. This is something I'm going to get into a lot more in the book on Epstein that I'm currently working on. But it's really remarkable, all the figures that turn up in it. And in relation to Mellon, he was in London in the early 60s, living in an apartment with a man named Thomas Corbally, a private detective who was very close to Roy Cohn, Donald Trump's infamous attorney / political mentor. Corbally had done a lot of work for Cohn over the years. Certainly there's a lot of indications that Corbally was deeply involved in sexual blackmail and this type of thing. In addition to showing up in Profumo, he also shows up in the Heidi Fleiss flap that unfolded in Hollywood in the early 90s, for instance. He knew Robert Evans and Jack Nicholson and that whole crowd and so forth. And I believe Operman actually had recently turned up some evidence. Robert Operman, the private detective who has the show on podcasts and so forth.
You mean Ed Opperman?
Ed Opperman, yes, sorry,
yes,
Ed Opperman, okay. Sorry. Yeah, Opperman had turned up some evidence that Fleiss's ring had actually been procuring minors for Robert Evans, so you kind of have that angle lingering in the background as well. But yeah, so Corbally is living in a flat in London with William Mellon Hitchcock, the future LSD financier. They're holding orgies and so forth out of this flat with British high society. You also have the Getty family from Texas, who's kind of making the scene with them too. They would of course go on to fund Kenneth Anger and some other very strange things over the years. But yeah, so Corbally encounters a man named Stephen Ward, who had been procuring girls for high members of British society. He had also been working with MI5 and probably MI6. And it seems that he had run a honey trap that had kind of backfired on the British. Essentially, one of his girls had an affair with a GRU officer, which is the Russian military intelligence, whose name escapes me at the moment, but she had slept with him at the same time she was sleeping with a man named John Profumo, who was essentially the equivalent of, I believe, not the Secretary of Defense in the United States, but something along those lines. Profumo, and this was, of course, a huge scandal in the UK. It brought down Macmillan's government, and there's also compelling evidence that this ring went well beyond even the UK, that John Kennedy had potentially been ensnared in it as well. And it's likely that's one of the things that Corbally was doing over there, to see if Kennedy had been compromised in this ring that had also had been, used by MI5, MI6, potentially the Soviets, and so on and so forth. So, this is a big event. William Mellon Hitchcock is there with Corbally, and eventually when Corbally seems to turn up evidence that Kennedy was involved in the ring, he goes to meet with the U.S. ambassador there at the time, which was David Bruce, who was an in-law of the Mellon family. Actually, I think at that point he was no longer an in-law. He had divorced from whatever member of the Mellon clan, but he was still very close to them. And Bruce was also a descendant of Robert the Bruce, one of the revered Scottish clan heads from way back when, one of the original kings of Scotland. But anyway, David Bruce is there with William Mellon Hitchcock, with Thomas Corbally, and essentially they lay out their findings in regards to Profumo and so on and so forth. And then Bruce reportedly informs Macmillan, though there's some dispute of this, but then he doesn't tell anybody directly linked to the U.S. government about it. Corbally goes back to the States, and then he starts meeting with Roy Cohn, and then from there they bring in the FBI. So certainly it kind of seems like this was a covert effort to really, take down the Kennedy presidency. There's been some speculation that it was a factor in the assassination itself. I mean, that's quite possible. I don't think it was necessarily a central issue, but potentially something lurking in the background. At the same time, Macmillan was taken down, so it kind of seems like this whole thing really played into plans for a change of government in both the U.S. and U.K., which is again something I'm going to get much more deeply into in my book on Epstein. But you've got a Mellon here at the center of all these intrigues, and you've got a former Mellon in-law who was still very close to the family, who was also playing a central role in all of this. So, this is just kind of one, instance in the modern era of the degree of influence that this family has had. And also you can kind of see the, politics that are involved in either side. Certainly William Mellon Hitchcock was known for, later funding the counterculture, even though by all accounts he was himself quite a conservative individual. But nonetheless, they were there at the founding of the counterculture, supporting Leary, supporting the spread of LSD, and so on and so forth. So, it's a very interesting setup. And then on top of that, there was, what was her name? It was a specific lady that Kennedy was having an affair with, Mary Muir, I believe. She was the wife of Cord Muir. But there's a lot of speculation that she had been giving LSD to Kennedy.
Interesting.
At some point, yeah, and she had also known Leary very closely. So on the flip side of the coin, you have potentially Peggy Hitchcock, William Mellon's sister, who's over here with Leary, who at the same time is in contact with this Mary Muir chick who was potentially giving Kennedy acid that Leary was supplying. And then she, Mary Muir, that is to say, was murdered quite horrendously in Washington, D.C. I guess maybe actually less than a year later. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it was at the time, it was a very sensational murder trial in which they still haven't officially found the killer yet.
So a couple of things from that. Have you heard of I do want to talk to Detective Jim Rothstein eventually on this, but Opperman tried to get him to answer because he used to say that who was it?
Cohn?
He used to say that Roy Cohn was running these kind of like these brownstone operations. And so a lot of those brownstone operations, I mean, definitely continued after Cohn's death, like, the Franklin scandal or Epstein. But it seems like the same, a lot of the similar playbook on all of those cases, where it's Duterte affair or Franklin or Epstein or even a Plumo affair. They all seem to be that same kind of blackmail playbook in a lot of ways of brownstone operations connected to higher level intelligence, do they not?
Yeah, certainly. I think you could draw certain similarities to all of these.
And also, one thing that you might find interesting is that in the investigative lead memo and in the finders, Petty met Walt Schneider, who was Timothy Leary and Billy Hitchcock's private pilot. And that's how he kind of inserted himself into being around Timothy Leary at that time. And also Finders member Willard Paulson, he kind of inserted himself into Leary's group at Millbrook. So there was a connection between the Finders and that whole nexus of the LSD drug culture back then, that Petty, of course, also seemed to steer or control or even set up the human potential movement around that time, too, as well, where a lot of that came from, too. So there was a connection with the Finders. That I've been able to mostly verify that it does seem to be correct in that regard, because Petty's also mentioned it in further interviews. But I thought you might find that interesting.
Yeah, no, that is actually extremely interesting. Certainly, I would appreciate if you could pass on the documentation you had on that,
yes,
if you wouldn't mind. I mean,
no, not at all.
But yeah, no, I mean, that would definitely be, quite significant. I mean, especially since one of the things I'm really getting into with the Epstein book is the ties between a lot of these rings, going back to Profumo and then kind of spreading into, the Franklin scandal, Epstein's whole thing, some of the stuff that core belief appears in, and certainly a lot of the pedophile rings that were later uncovered in the UK and so forth as well. And, it's really quite just a horrific story, but one that certainly needs to be told.
Yeah, I've got more backup on the Finders too, where I was sent by Henry Clements, Ramon J. Martinez's whistleblower report that Martinez had filed. that pretty much showed how the customs agency did railroad him because of him being a whistleblower, and corroborated a lot of his previous report. I also came in contact with Bob Harold. Robert Harold was Ramon J. Martinez's partner, and he also confirmed a lot of what Ramon had found as well too, and actually told me some more things like before the finder's warehouse was raided, that a whole bunch of vans pulled up, and they put a whole bunch of boxes that Chinese people had owned warehouse space near the warehouse had mentioned to them, and that they had filled the van up with boxes and boxes and boxes and drove off before it was raided. As well as they also found a map of the actual map of the underground tunnels of Washington D.C. in the finder's W Street apartments.
Yes, that's yes, that would be definitely quite unsettling.
Yeah, so I have verified further since we last talked about it. So I just wanted to let you know that the finder's case is definitely moving along. So let's go back to the Mellons. What about Richard Mellon Scafie and his connections to the right, hardcore right, should I say, and John Birch Society, Counts for National Policy type? What information do you have on him?
Well, Richard Mellon Scafie was the son of Sarah Mellon, who, of course, later would go on to marry, what was his name? Andrew Scaife, I believe, who was himself an OSS officer, which is quite interesting. And another thing about his parents that I had only recently kind of turned up is the fact that they were both involved in what I've kind of come to think of as the World Commerce Corporation network, or the I suppose the WCC network would be the most apt description. But this was a company that was set up pretty much following the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, along with its sister corporation, the British American Canadian Corporation. The BACC had been established by Sir William Stevenson, who had headed the British Security Coordination in the United States during the Second World War. And essentially, this was the British intelligence agency that oversaw all of North America. And contrary to what you hear, this was actually the agency that the OSS was modeled upon, rather than MI6 or the Special Operations Executive or something like that, because it was effectively one-stop shopping, much as the OSS was. But anyway, Stevenson had set up this corporation, and there had been a lot of this agency, and there had been a lot of hostility towards it from the rest of the British intelligence establishment, especially MI6, and there had been a lot of pressure to disband it after the war come to an end. And obviously a lot of people were not keen on this, because it was generally seen that this a lot of great assets were here. It wasn't, they didn't want to lose these people. So they set up the BACC. Stevenson is ahead of it. There's a lot of other figures who were involved with it, who had been working for the British Security Coordination or the Special Operations Executive, which was also disbanded at the end of the war. And it was essentially a way to preserve these assets while they were trying to figure out what to do with them, more or less. And then in the States, you had the World Commerce Corporation, which eventually William Donovan, the founder and head of the OSS, would also become involved with. And it essentially served the same purpose that the BACC did. This was a place for them to stash the assets from the OSS after it was disbanded, in the kind of intern years between its disbandment and the rise of the Central Intelligence Group, which eventually became the CIA. But even after the kind of dust had settled, these companies continued. The BACC was eventually bought up by the WCC, and they became one kind of mega conglomerate. And they continued on until the early 1960s, and definitely were used for a lot of off-the-books operations, especially by the British. But as to this Mellon family, there were several people linked to it. David Bruce was an early investor, for instance, but both Sarah Mellon Scafie and her husband, Alan Scafie, were also early investors in this company as well. So kind of from like the very get-go, this family that would produce Richard Mellon Scafie was already, continuing on in this sort of black private intelligence network even after the Second World War had ended. And I mean, this would have brought them into contact potentially with people like Donovan, with William Stevenson, and so forth. So that's kind of interesting, especially in light of Scafe's later involvement in intelligence work in the 60s and whatnot. He came to become a major benefactor for the World Forum Feature, which was essentially a full-blown CIA press agency that Scaife was a major founder for. And one of the guys who came to work there was Brian Crozer, who would go on to become a major figure in Le Cercle. He was actually a chairman in the 1980s, but Crozer had made contact with a man named Frank Barnett, who was a big figure in the American Security Council and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
He would go on to found the National Strategic Information Center, which had William Casey as a member of it and so forth, Prescott Bush Jr., just a lot of major figures in the right and what have you. And it was a very elitist organization, unlike the ASC, which was kind of meant for a broader public, so to speak. The NSIC was certainly a more elite network that kind of managed this broader network that the ASC personified for many years. But anyway, Barnett, I believe, had probably learned about Crozer through his involvement with the World Forum Feature, or potentially also the Interdoc Network, one or the two. According to Crozer, just one morning in 1965, while Crozer was in Franco's Spain doing a biography on the Generalissimo, Barnett shows up at his door unsolicited and essentially tells him that he wants him to, go to work for him, essentially. Crozer was, preoccupied with the biography of Franco, told him that he would need a little time to finish that up, but, they kind of hooked up again in the late 1960s, around 69, I think, and Barnett helped Crozer set up the Institute for the Study of Conflict, which became a major propaganda outfit for the right in the UK throughout the 70s and so forth. And the source of funding for this that Barnett set him up with was Scaife. So he was essentially a major patron of him for many years, and this potentially continued on into the mid-70s when Crozer was basically setting up these full-blown private intelligence networks such as SHIELD and the 6i and so forth. This was initially, I guess they had the objective of recreating the Special Operations Executive, the UK's covert action arm during the Second World War. And when that proved to be a little too controversial, they settled for trying to recreate the Political Warfare Executive, the propaganda arm of the SOE. Especially after the Information Research Department had been shuttered in the mid-70s. But, this was a very exclusive network. It had ravaged the UK quite considerably and paved the way for the rise of Thatcher in much the same way what Casey and his, merry band were doing in the US to bring about Reaganism. And of course, this would also bring Crozer into contact with some other interesting people over the years. Later patrons were Sir James Goldsmith and Rupert Murdoch. So, it was a very incestuous network, to put it mildly.
Yeah, did you get a chance to see Where's My Roy Cohn yet?
No, I have not.
I watched it. I could tell you it's worth watching. I don't know if you really find anything really too different that you do, really any new information that you don't know, maybe a thing here and there. But they really talk about Roy Cohn's relationship with Rupert Murdoch, which I found very interesting. I knew about it, but just the detail of how Roy Cohn helped Murdoch and kind of as far as his media empire and his connections within the Republican Party, they briefly talk about it some in the documentary, but not really too much. Actually, they only spent about I'd say almost 15 to 20 minutes about Trump and his connections to Roy Cohn. There wasn't really much in there. The rest of it was just about Roy Cohn himself. But I think it's definitely worth watching, though. So with Richard Mellon Scaife, he had connections to many of the Republican right organizations like the Heritage Foundation. I remember when I was doing my research on Thomas Fenton and I played his Council for National Policy speech for the Judicial Watch. It was Richard Mellon Scaife donated a lot of money to the foundation of Judicial Watch. And so I found that interesting, and you mentioned that in your blog on Richard Mellon Scaife as well. Um, but as far as Scaife, what do you think his role was in like maybe like the Council for National Policy, or did you come across any role that he had within the John Birch Society, a founding of them, or I guess we can also discuss. I had Hopsicker, George, and I interviewed him Monday, and you mentioned from his work talking about Scaife had funded the Clinton Chronicles. So let's talk about all that.
Uh, Actually, give me just 1 second.
Yes. So yeah, one thing I found interesting, the people in the chat, is that with Richard Mellon Scaife, was that it does seem like he had pretty strong connections to all three of the presidencies in some regard, whether it was Reagan, both the Bushes, and Clinton in of itself, where he tried to actually come against Clinton, but at the same time had connections like most right-wing people at the time the Iran-Contra affair, and Mena, Arkansas, which we know Mena, Arkansas, with which Hopsicker and George and I had discussed, has connections both to the right and to the left. The Council for National Policy and the Council for Foreign Relations. Mena, Arkansas was, the Clintons. It was, the drug running that was going on during that time period was also had involvement in the Iran-Contra affair and Oliver North and Barry Seal and George H.W. Bush, Jeb Bush. So there's a lot of connections between all of them, and so the left and right were running that operation together, and so Richard Mellon Scaife, though, it seemed like he was trying to expose the Clintons to some degree through the Clinton Chronicles, and of course putting out Larry Nichols, which I'm pretty sure many people in the chat have heard Larry Nichols. He'll come on Alex Jones sometimes. He'll come on he'll come on Larry Nichols will come on Jeff Rent's show sometimes, and he usually gives the same spill about how crooked the Clintons are. And I'm not saying the Clintons are not crooked. I'm not saying that at all. But the thing with Larry Nichols is that he doesn't really discuss any of the right's involvement in these crimes too as well, which I'm pretty sure you've seen that too, Recluse, if you've ever heard Larry Nichols talk, as he primarily seems to focus on the crimes of the Clintons, which are numerous. I'm not saying they're not, but he doesn't talk about a lot of people within the rights and on the right and their involvement in the drug trafficking that was occurring during that time period.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, to some extent, I kind of think that rather than exposing the Clintons, I think Scaife was trying to almost set them up as a kind of preeminent boogeyman, if you will, for the left wing or the right wing, so to speak. I mean, certainly the Clintons have become one of the most crucial rallying points for the right, really, in the post-Cold War years. So it's not necessarily that the Clintons are more evil, I think, than a lot of these political dynasties. And I'm not, trying to suggest that the Clintons aren't evil.
Yeah,
they certainly are. But I mean,
yeah.
I don't know that they're more exceptionally evil than a lot of the other families out there. And,
Yes.
in my opinion, they are not necessarily as powerful as some of the other families
No.
either. Certainly,
They wouldn't be as powerful as the Rothschild family, for example. The
certainly
Clintons,
not.
no.
Well, I mean, even in the case of the Bush family, I mean, the Bush family were wealthy and powerful for close to a century before the Clintons had really emerged.
Very much so.
And in a lot of ways, I mean, the Clintons were very much a creation of the Bush family. So certainly there is that kind of aspect in it too. And I mean, you could also potentially go into some the inner conflicts within the Reagan administration as well. There was a bit of a conflict between George H.W. Bush and William Casey. Bush was certainly more the kind of establishment Republican right, if you will, whereas Casey, while being very much from that background, had generally made cause more so with the far right. And there had been some conflicts between those two. In fact, I think at different times they were essentially both trying to spy on each other through various assets and so forth. So Scafie might have been essentially also trying to, lash out at the Bush family indirectly through exposing the Clintons as well to satisfy the faction of the right that he was in league with. I mean, there's all these kind of things playing out. And, it's obviously, this is one of the things in general about the Mellon family I find to be interesting, is just how much they've really manipulated both sides
Yes.
in these various conflicts. I mean, a great example of that would be the abortion debate. Scafie was really, for a lot of years, one of the principal financial backers of the pro-life movement, while on the same hand, a lot of the other Mellon family members have been, major financial contributors to the pro-choice movement.
Yeah,
so,
to Planned Parenthood. I saw that you had mentioned that. So it was like, okay, it's almost like the cremation of care or absolution of sins. Well, I'm funding pro-life movements, so it's no, it's no problem for the rest of my many wealthy members within my family to fund Planned Parenthood. It's sad in that regard. I mean, myself being pro-life, a lot of people won't talk about how there is a lot of eugenics policies within the hidden right, within the Council for National Policy, within the a lot of the Knights of Malta and everything like that. They kind of downplay that, and that's why I think majority of the Council for National Policy talking points, like being pro-life, for example, they might use that as a talking point, and some members of the CNP very well are probably pro-life. However, when it comes to the lead at the top, I'm pretty sure they're just as much as for eugenics as you could see in the early foundation of the CNP. Just like members of the CFR would be so it's kind of, I harp on the CNP more, I guess, because it angers me that them claiming to be Christian and right, on the right side and everything, conservative and everything like that, they're not really. It's a lot of, for a lot of people within the CNP, it's just talking. That's all it is.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I mean, on top of that, I mean, you have the whole, just, the manipulation that's going on with mainline Christianity. I mean, especially beginning in the Cold War era. But I mean, you could probably draw a line even further back with the moral rearmament movement, which was really instrumental in setting up, or I shouldn't say setting up, and influencing at least the Unification Church of Sun Mayan Moon in the Cold War era, as well as the Family/Fellowship, which hosts the National Prayer Breakfast. I mean, it's another very elite, fundamentalist Christian network. Mike Pence, for instance, is reportedly a member of it, and so forth. So, yeah, I mean, a lot of this stuff has been badly manipulated, really, as a part of, the general assault on spiritual beliefs and so forth. And certainly a lot of conspiracy researchers, when they look into this, they tend to focus more on, the human potential movement and the New Age movement and occultism and so forth, without realizing that Christianity was every bit as much of a target as these other more fringe movements were. And I'm actually right now in the middle of reading a excellent book by Miles Copeland, the longtime CIA officer who is the father of Stuart Copeland, the drummer for the Police. But Miles, it's called The Game Player, and Miles Copeland in there essentially goes into allegedly the CIA's attempt to manipulate what he refers to as occult forces. And he kind of said, on the one hand, you have the high occultism of the moral rearmament movement and these, really elite Christian networks. And then on the other hand, he had what he referred to as kind of the low occult movement, which he kind of specified as being personified by Scientology, which he alleges that they had in fact made outreaches towards. So, it's very interesting how, and, in this sense as well, you're kind of playing two sides against one another. I mean, the Christian fundies on the one hand, and then on the other hand, these kind of fringe New Age groups and so forth. And the Mellons were essentially a private, manifestation of the same type of manipulation.
Yeah, you had mentioned too in your blog about how the Mellon family, but just like the Council for National Policy, had a lot to do with the stoking of dominionism and Christian Reconstructionism with R.J. Rushdoony and Tim LaHaye and Beverly LaHaye, and it's also the moral majority too, and everything that came from all that. So it seems to be that the Mellon family, at least on the surface, appeared to be very pro-Zionist which you'll see a lot with the Christian Reconstructionist theory to some degree, or you'll see it with definitely with the dominionism. Most with dominionism, you'll definitely see pro-Zionist backing by Christians, and that's what they when they turn into Pat Robertson or a lot of the Christians that came out of that kind of like the CMP backing with everything. You'll get a lot of pro-Zionist dominionism. Like the United States has a right to be imperial and have dominion over the earth. And like you mentioned with the family, have you ever watched the Netflix documentary? The family?
No. You're the second person who's asked me that now. No, I haven't. I'm aware of it, but no, I haven't quite had a chance to get around to watching it. People continuously are asking me to watch this and that. It's just insane how many things that I have to watch.
Yeah, me too. I watched it and I've read the book. And I will say the book is better than the show. So I would suggest maybe if you had time to actually listen to the book on Audible to watch the show.
No, I've read the book.
You've read? Okay. So you've read the book. The show isn't much. There's not. I mean, you might learn a few things here and there, but there's not much difference in the book really, except for maybe the Russian connection to all of this, which the Russia's the left is just as connected to Russia as the right is. So it's. But yeah, I mean, with the family, the National Prayer Breakfast and everything, and their control of dominionism, and talking about how you have to meet and with all the leaders in the world and venerate the Wolf King, and which is Satan, instead of the Good Shepherd, which is Jesus. It's just very interesting of how they kind of downplay all that when you just look at the CMP as being what they say for Judeo-Christian values, but in reality it's just to bring theocracy and dominionism across the whole earth. Because my belief is the reason why separation of church and state exists, and I'm a Christian, is because we can't live under a theocracy or even a Christian divine right theocracy, because man is fallible. So it's going to definitely cause some issues, but it seems to be what the CMP is pushing. You'll see it a lot with Eric Prince and Blackwater, which I guess is now is it Academy? What are they calling themselves now? Do you know?
Maybe Academia or something like
It's something like
Academia,
that. But they actually got another defense contract here recently, and I think that might be what future wars are going to be. Maybe even the war in Iran or Syria or anything like that might be ran, not so much of them having to do a draft, but them running through private contractors. But you'll see a lot of Knight of Malta, a lot of interesting symbology when it comes to Eric Prince. And did you see the Donald? I know we're going a little bit off topic, but did you see the Donald Trump Jr. Instagram photo of him having a gun with the Maltese cross until like a night at the clip, and Hillary Clinton behind bars at the clip? Did you see that?
No, I did not, but that's very interesting.
Yeah, the name of the name of the gun was Crusader. Of course, Eric Prince called his armored personnel carrier Crusader 1. So it is what it is. You know what I mean? With all the research you've done on the Knights of Malta, and the Jesuit faction too within that Opus Dei and everything, it seems par for the course, does it not?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, this is sort of again, if we want to go even further back, I mean, more of this sort of perversion of Christianity, if you will. I mean, certainly an institution like the Knights of Malta, I mean, this was really very much an attempt to preserve the whole notion of aristocracy and divine bloodlines, this type of thing, that really in a lot of ways Christianity was opposed to. I mean, that was very much a pagan custom in the ancient world. The only really
the divine rights of kings.
Yes, there was really attributed, the only individuals in ancient society that any kind of merit or worth was attributed to were the elites, and that was because of their bloodlines, because they stood above the common man. And that was really one of the major revolutions, if you will, of Christianity in the West and Buddhism in the East, is it really put the emphasis on everyone. Every life had value. Every soul was special, and so on and so forth. And, that really was the foundation of humanism, which, in this day and age is something that would be horrifying to many secular humanists. But that's really the truth of the matter. And, there have been these, just insane attempts to continue on this aristocratic tradition within Christianity that really have been a major perversion of what it was mentally meant to be. So, this has been kind of an ongoing war that's carried on now for centuries. And certainly in recent years, it's gone up a notch with the manipulation, the psychological manipulation that's been applied by various intelligence agencies and private individuals.
Oh yeah, I mean you see it through. I mean as early as some people could say the corruption of the Catholic Church, and what spawned from there, and it's been happening ever since. And far the farther along the way that we go, the more that we get away from true Christianity, and in modern times, the Council for National Policy has played, Christian Reconstructionism and Dominionism has played a huge role in all that. I mean that's where we get a lot of our foreign policy from today. From Dominionism, at the behest of Israel, to conquer the Middle East. A lot of that comes from Dominionism, and you'll see many of the Dominionist type pastors, many of them being put forth on the Salem Media Group communications run by Basel, and high CMP members running it, out there cheering the loudest that we have to conquer the Middle East, and I'm not saying that Islam hasn't caused any issues or anything like that. I'm not an apologist for Islam, but me as being a staunch anti-war, and my belief in us avoiding war, a lot of these conflicts that we're having in the Middle East is a lot of it's just school play done by the powers that be themselves. And so that's what we're left with. We're left by this huge division within the United States where, Christians, if you don't support the wars in the Middle East, if you don't support us taking over Iran because God is with Trump, then you're not a real Christian. That's we're stuck. We're stuck in between the middle, because if you don't support the war with Iran, then you're not with Israel. And you're not with God, or you're not with Trump. But if you're not really for Iran either, then that becomes a problem too in the conspiracy culture. You're stuck between a side that Jesse Spotts has talked about. It's unfair. You're stuck picking between Iran and Israel or United States, and you're like, well, I don't want to choose either. I mean, it is what it is. But it's a sad state of affairs that we're living in currently.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, well, just in general, the attempts to drive all of this outrage towards Iran, which, it has one of the most educated populaces in that whole region of the world. It's in many ways a much more progressive society than many of the other countries there. I mean, certainly Saudi Arabia, for instance, a country that only just, I think, abolished slavery officially in 1964 or something like that. And again, I'm not trying to say that Iran, does not have its own, internal problems and so forth, but certainly they have a lot of things going for them. And, you see this general depiction that Iran is trying to erect this, full-blown theocracy that it's going to be the head of in the Islamic world or something. It's nonsense. They're Shiites. Shiites, I believe, are only about 10 to 15% of the total Islamic population in the world, and many Sunnis consider them to be heretics. So it's not going to happen. It's just Iran will never be anywhere near the kind of power within the Islamic world that a lot of these propagandists on the right in this country would have you believe they are, for the simple reason that most mainline Muslims, i.e. Sunnis, consider them to be heretics. It's just ridiculous. And it's completely driven, really, by the Israeli lobby and, like you're saying, a lot of these dominionists and so forth, many of whom want to, rebuild the temple and so forth, and have supported Zionism for the sake of bringing on the apocalypse, effectively.
Yeah, I mean, similar to Sabbateanism with Sabbatai Zevi during the 1600s. I mean, they sin boldly and with no regard, and that's where we're at. I mean, if people don't realize that there's so many power players involved with all this, and that's interesting, for us to talk about, I guess, parapolitics for a minute. Before we end the conversation, just because what's going on with Iran right now, where everybody, the QAnon and the MAGA hat wearing people are saying, well, Trump's just brokered peace with Iran for our lifetime, and nothing's going to happen at all, because Iran didn't attack any military bases. Well, I mean, they did attack military bases per se, but they didn't. They just did damage. They didn't kill any military officials or any Iraqis or anything like that. So because there was no loss of life, therefore it's a de-escalation and nothing's going to happen. I seriously doubt that over a period of time. We'll see. Maybe things aren't popping off as hot as they appeared to be early last night, which is why I didn't come on the air to mention anything. I wanted to see what would happen. But yeah, I mean, Russia's involved in all this. Everybody loves to get down and kiss Putin's behind. But Russia, of course, has very strong connections to Israel currently right now with Bibi Netanyahu and Chabad Lubavitch. So, I mean, Russia isn't going to come save Iran. It's just not. I seriously doubt it's going to happen. And anybody saying otherwise, it's very strange that a lot of people put forth that conspiracy that that Russia is going to be the savior of Iran. I just don't see it. Maybe China, but not Russia, with them being so cozy to Israel at this time and being so cozy to the Vatican to some degree too. I mean, all these countries are. I mean, that's the whole, the Jesuits' role in all this, the Vatican's role in all this, the Zionist roles and all. There's just so many competing factions or factions that may come together at the top of the power structure. What's your take on all that, Recluse?
Yeah, I mean, I do think the current flap with Iran is being overblown. I mean, certainly, like you're saying, we don't know how this is going to play out, and it might, in hindsight, be seen as a minor factor in contributing to a broader war, but I don't see that happening at this time. And certainly I would agree with you strongly. Russia is not going to trigger a third world war to save Iran. It's just ridiculous. It's not going to happen. And I would say, certainly from the perspective of the Russians, the Iranians are a very disposable ally to them. In a lot of ways, it really is kind of a partnership of convenience more than anything else. And certainly with Russia making a lot of overtures to Israel in recent years, the Russians just are not going to gallop in there and risk, further escalation that might, go into a world war or something to that effect. It's just not going to happen. So, Iran, I don't see it trying to take major military action, but I do think one factor that could be a major issue is cyber attacks and something to that effect. That would be kind of, in my opinion, the most likely form of retaliation, and something that they would be able to do that could wreak major havoc on the United States without taking a significant risk on their own part.
Or it's a possibility that the world order could stage some sort of mass cyber attack and be blamed on Iran even if they didn't do it. Or it's a possibility that some quote-unquote sleeper cells will be quote-unquote activated, and something will either happen in Iraq or in the European Union or even in the United States that will be blamed on the Iranians, whether or not they had any they did it or not. We know Soleimani, for example, from the Iraqi prime minister, apparently the United States had contacted Iran to try to broker peace between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and that's where Soleimani was going. He was heading towards Saudi Arabia to try to broker that peace, and that's when they killed him. So, if that is true, if we believe the Iraqi prime minister, then that's really messed up and underhanded. But what do we expect from the United States? People both on the right and the left are all of a sudden forgetting that the FBI and the CIA and all the intelligence agencies within the United States, and even the ones abroad, Mossad, France, England, Australia, the Swiss, the Vatican, whatever you want to, Russia, all of them, they're all corrupt. So both sides give credit to whomever it serves purpose for their own needs because they need a rah-rah go team all the time. And that's a major problem. And I saw it a lot with the past couple of days with Iran and how people would flip back and forth. And, and that's why I wanted to wait and see before I really talked about it, because it's difficult to tell what is going on. They've been wanting war with Iran since the hostage crisis. Recluse, would you say, or probably even before then? And the United States has been involved. The first CIA's overthrowment of Mossadegh with Operation Ajax was the CIA's first, overthrowing of a government to put our puppet state in with the Shah. So, I mean, how many times have we worked with or worked against or whatever with Iran? Iran-Contra affair, where weapons were brokered from the United States to Israel to Iran. The Afghan-Iranian, not Afghan-Iranian, the Afghan, the Iraqi-Iranian war. I mean, how many times? It just never ends. The Iranian people have no reason to trust us, and we have no reason to trust our intelligence agencies.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, kind of going back to the coup that originally brought the Shah back to power in 1953, I mean, even then you can really see just the sheer corruption of that, because I mean, people kind of forget that the original spark, if you will, that had triggered all this was the attempt to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian oil company, which was a British oil company. In fact, it eventually became British Petroleum. And that had spurred BP, what would become BP, to ask MI6 to intervene and try to restore or overthrow Mossadegh and restore the Shah to complete control. And so this whole thing essentially started as an MI6 operation, and they really had done most of the legwork for all of this. The CIA didn't become, in fact, originally the American government had actually refused to become involved in it under Truman, because at the time they were trying to move on from colonialism for the European allies, which they saw as essentially a dead end in the developing world and so forth. So there was a lot of reluctance in the United States in even getting involved in this in the first place. Finally, Eisenhower was elected. The British once again made overtures to the U.S. about giving them a little money and additional covert support, and
Yeah.
Ike wanted a cut of the oil revenue. That was essentially what got the United States involved in this whole coup d'etat. It wasn't even necessarily the geopolitics. It was a cut of the oil money that the British were sitting on and access to a nation that essentially had been a fiefdom of the British for many years at that point in time. So, I mean, it was a very cynical ploy in a lot of ways.
And Churchill was foaming at the mouth for that, wasn't he? He was foaming at the mouth.
Yes. So, and I mean, it was kind of the same thing that kind of, turned up again. And the whole issue was Suez, the Suez crisis and so forth, which is just bizarre on so many levels. Essentially, the United States was working with Nasser, who had just, signed a huge arms pact with the Soviet Union and the Gehlen organization, and a lot of these former Nazis on the one side against the British and the French and the Israelis, actually. In fact, I think Suez was one of the only instances when the United States was really openly pitted against the Israelis in any kind of conflict. So it was just, a curious instance on a lot of ways. But on the flip side of the coin, if you kind of look at it from the perspective of the United States, well, Nasser was seen as somebody that they could work with, even though he had made overtures to the Soviets. They recognized, at least in that era, that he was a nationalist. He did not want to become, he did not want Egypt to become a fiefdom of the Soviet Union, even less than he wanted to remember. Sorry, I can't talk now suddenly. No more than he wanted to remain a pawn of the British Empire. So there was kind of this sense we could support these nationalist movements. They're not necessarily a threat, to turn over full blown to the communists on the one hand. On the other hand, they would also enable us to get a foothold in a region of the world that previously the Europeans had really had a stranglehold on. So, I mean, there was a lot of this devious, underhanded stuff, which, we were kind of superficially backstabbing our own allies, some of our closest allies. Once again, in this same region of the world where we're now kind of seeing this, insanity playing out with, Iran, and like you were saying, these peace overtures potentially with the Saudis and so forth. So, I mean, this corruption has been there really from the very beginning, when this type of stuff started to go into full effect in the Cold War, and really to some extent even earlier, going back to the OSS days. I mean, certainly an argument could be made that William Donovan was essentially a pawn of the British, an agent of William Stevenson. And then on the flip side of the coin, you have Dulles and his very close ties to Nazi Germany. So there was probably a certain extent foreign intelligence agencies playing out their own conflicts and to a certain extent for the heart and soul of the OSS. And
Yeah.
in many ways, this probably continued on into the creation of the CIA and so forth.
Yeah, and shout out to Jimmy Jean in the chat from Into the Microcosm. He's a good friend of the show. He posted in the chat that Richard Nixon gave the Iranian Shah the same printing presses the United States has used. And I had pulled up an article from the Los Angeles Times back in 1992 where they were trying to accuse Iran of printing fake United States money that they were counterfeiting, and it was reported by the House Republicans at the time, and that was circulating with serious help. So they were even trying to the old printed presses that we gave them ourselves. They're trying to set up almost you would want to say fake news, even back then against Syria and Iran. So it's very funny. It's all right. Well, Recluse, I know you got to go, brother. I definitely want to have you on again soon. Is there anything else that you want to say out there to the chat? Anything you got coming up, brother? Anything you think of?
Well, like, still working on the Epstein book, hoping to get my other book on Colonia Dignidad and actually the Mellon family. There's going to be a big essay in the Mellon family on the forthcoming book as well. Hopefully we can get it out in the next couple of weeks. It's been a bit of a struggle, kind of hope to have it out in time for Christmas, but didn't quite work out. But hopefully we can get something going here in the next couple of weeks. And, of course, I got the weekly podcast on the farm with Frank Zero, so check us out there, too.
Will do.
Get a lot of curious topics there, and might have some other big projects in the works too. So yeah, trying to stay busy and keep up the good work, hopefully.
Well, definitely, Chris, thank you for having me on. When you release the book, brother, I'll buy it and I'll read it, and I'll have you back on to interview you about it. But I definitely want to thank you on. Everybody in the chat loves you. They can't get enough of you. I want to let you know, and you're an excellent researcher, and I love reading your work and your blog and everything. And hope you take care, and we'll have you on again soon.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I'd love to be back as soon as possible.
Okay, have a good evening. Bye. All right, that's it for this episode. Hope you guys enjoyed it of Dudes Talking, episode number 34, with a dear friend of the show and an excellent researcher, Recluse from VISUPview. So go check Recluse's workout. He definitely knows what he's talking about, and links to everything to his work, so you can follow the information he put out with the sources that he gives. But that's it. Until next time, as always, continue reading the documents. Good night, everybody.